This is CBC Vancouver News.
Hospital Nolay was a dedicated, caring, and positive young officer.
An avalanche claims the life of a second BC Mountie as the city of Nelson grieves the loss.
Life is full of dreams. He had so many dreams.
Laid to rest, the victim of a fatal Christmas Eve bus crash near Merritt is remembered.
This is the beginning of a new era in Canada for our people.
Addressing the collective harm caused by Canada's past, 325 First Nations receive a multi-billion-dollar settlement from a class action lawsuit. Good evening, I'm Lien Yeung. Thanks for joining us. The people of Nelson are mourning the death of a second police officer today, 11 days after two off-duty officers were caught in an avalanche while backcountry skiing. The second officer has succumbed to his injuries in hospital. Constable Matthew Nolay suffered extreme internal injuries and died this morning. 43-year-old Constable Wade Tiddamore died on scene. Nelson's police chief says he visited Nolay while he was in hospital and he was upbeat prior to his passing. The department is now grieving the constable's death.
It's hard to fully express the sadness the department is feeling right now. The memorial for Constable Tiddamore was earlier this week, and now we've lost a second officer, as well as a friend and a part of our Nelson police family. It has been truly devastating.
Nolay was just 28 years old. He worked in Nelson for over a year and then served with the Calgary Police prior to that. Nearly a month after a tragic bus crash on Christmas Eve, one of the four victims was laid to rest in Delta today. Karanjot Sodhi's family arrived from India to bid a final farewell to him. Our Saurabh Sandhu was there.
Navjeet Kaur Sodhi has undertaken perhaps the most difficult journey of her life, traveling thousands of miles across the continents to see the face of her husband Karanjot Singh Sodhi just one final time. By her side are her two young children, their son Sahib and daughter Hargun. Karanjot's mother has also accompanied them from India. Sodhi himself lost his father when he was only 12.
The kids are very small. The boy is only 7 years and the girl, baby girl, only 3 years. They did not know what happens with her father.
The 41-year-old was one of the four people who died on Christmas Eve after their bus rolled over east of Merritt on an icy highway. Sodhi was going from Kelowna to Surrey to meet his cousin.
Life is full of dreams. He had so many dreams.
He was working at a winery in Oliver. His colleagues were among those paying their respect. Co-worker Michael Collins says this wasn't how he imagined meeting Sodhi's family for the first time. He tells CBC Sodhi was kind of person who lit up every room he walked into. His cousin says family is thankful for the community's support but is worried about its future.
He is the only person for the financial situation for her family.
The family says their ICBC claim has been approved and are waiting on word on what happens next. Saurabh Sandhu, CBC News, Delta.
And a major settlement has been reached over the harm inflicted by Canada's residential schools. Ottawa has announced a deal worth almost $3 billion. The money will go to several hundred First Nations seeking reparations for loss of Indigenous language and culture. It puts an end to litigation that began here in BC courts more than a decade ago. Yasmin Gandham has the details.
$2.8 billion. That's the price settled on by First Nations and the federal government to compensate bands across the country for lost language and culture due to residential schools.
While settlements that are being announced like these today do not erase or make up for the past, what it can do is help address the collective harm caused by Canada's past.
It still needs approval from a federal court, but plans are already falling into place to distribute the funds. Miller said the trust fund will support the 4 pillars of revival, protection, promotion, and wellness of Indigenous cultures. It will operate for 20 years and run independent of the federal government. The case, known as the Gottfriedson case, was named after former BC Regional Chief Shane Gottfriedson, who filed it a decade ago alongside Sechelt band councillor Gary Feschek.
But Gary and I decided with our councils that we would stand together for our own day scholars and also for all of the Indigenous people in Canada who lived with Canada's racist legacy.
Indigenous nations will now be able to lead their own cultural revival efforts with the funds, with more details expected in the months to come.
$325 million from the fund will immediately be distributed to the nations.
Grant says it is entirely up to the nations how they wish to spend the settlement money, but Gottfriedson hopes to put it towards preserving his culture.
Looking at going for possibly a full immersion school, teaching the language for our kids.
Officials will appear before a federal court judge in Vancouver on February 27 to seek approval for the settlement. Indigenous leaders say although it doesn't erase their history in residential schools, they hope it can change the future. Yasmin Gantam, CBC News, Vancouver.
A price hike in the Kootenays has some residents steaming mad. Admission fees at 3 public hot springs have more than doubled. People relying on those hot springs in Radium, Banff and Jasper say the lack of local swimming pools leaves them with few options. As Corey Bullock reports, they want a discounted rate for locals.
I have 2 young children, a 7-week-old and a 3-year-old, and I want them to be able to swim.
For Natasha Shorb's family, a dip in the local hot springs has always been a highlight. But as of the new year, prices have more than doubled. Kootenay locals like her rely on Radium Hot Springs. The next closest public pool is about 100 kilometers away.
Honestly, when I heard about the increase, the doubling of the prices, I was really crushed.
Invermere residents rallied today to make their concerns known. Fees have also gone up at the public hot springs in Banff and Jasper. Passes went from $8 to $16.50 for an adult. It doubled for seniors and youth as well. The family rate jumped from $24.50 to $53.
Prices have doubled, and people who live in remote areas like Invermere and Radium, we don't have rec centers.
What do you think about the price increase here at the pools?
It's probably something that was a long time coming. The prices were low for decades. It's maybe a shock to people that it went up so fast, but it's probably at a level that is similar to other places now.
Parks Canada, which runs the hot springs, says the raise is necessary.
Canadian Rockies hot springs sites were frozen between 2004 and 2020 and therefore have not substantially increased over the past 18 years. And during this time, operational costs have obviously increased significantly.
England says annual passes didn't go up by as much, but it will still set a family of 4 back $652, a 59% jump.
That's just putting it over the top for them to be able to take their families and be able to go and have some fun.
England adds that entry fees only cover about 30% of costs. Taxes make up the rest. Parks Canada recently announced a $13 million investment into the hot springs, and it's open to a subsidized cost-sharing agreement to bring down the prices for locals. The area's mayor says local policy doesn't currently allow for it, but that could change.
We're open to hearing anything they have to say and want to make sure it's something that's feasible for our community.
Until then, families will be stuck with the fee hike. Corey Bullock, CBC News, Cranbrook.
Rising concern among hospital patients in Port Hardy as its doctor shortage hits a critical low, dropping from 3 emergency room doctors to just 1.
Does this mean that cancer cases will be diagnosed too late? Yes. Does it mean that potentially patients will die because of care delivered too late? Well, I hope not.
This week, 2 Port Hardy doctors resigned in part due to burnout, something Nataros says is common for rural communities where doctors are pushed to their limits. Yesterday, Island Health extended overnight closures of the Port Hardy Hospital Emergency Department until February 6, but the shortage is creating extreme strain.
We're supposed to have 7 doctors for a population our size.
Port Hardy is the largest community on the North Island, and island health data shows that from last year, July, the Port Hardy ER was closed 25% of the time due to staffing issues. A young man from Surrey has been charged with second-degree murder in the death of a Coquitlam senior. The Integrated Homicide Investigation Team says 21-year-old Jeffrey Stevens from Surrey was arrested and charged on Friday. Last February, 66-year-old Terry Miller was found with stab wounds in the area of Schoolhouse Street. He died 2 weeks later in hospital. Stevens is also facing an assault charge related to a second victim. IHIT did not provide details on a possible motive or whether the suspect and victims knew each other. Well, a Saanich city councillor is trying to change the way we hand out our traffic tickets based on your income level.
The current fine system disproportionately impacts people with lower incomes, and that fines currently fail to serve as an effective deterrent to the very wealthy. And this motion tries to solve both of those problems.
The goal is to level the playing field while still keeping streets safe. He says a $100 fine is more of a financial strain for some, but an easy expense for others. The motion will be discussed at the Saanich Council meeting next week, but the decision to change traffic fines ultimately lies in the hands of the province. BC Housing has announced the purchase of a permanent year-round shelter site in Cranbrook.
Our focus is really on creating a welcoming space for people, to create a space that people feel like they can come in and they're not judged and they have access to very important services that they have not had in a very long time.
The fast-growing East Kootenay community has had a temporary shelter for the past 3 years. The building purchase is currently home to Community Connections, a nonprofit that will operate the shelter. BC Housing says the building will need renovations. The housing agency expects work to be done later this year. It also purchased the lot that the building is on, meaning there's potential for growth in the future. And from Steveston to James Bay, it was a busy morning near the water as seafood lovers eagerly bought more than 10,000 pounds of herring for the annual fundraiser, Fishermen Helping Kids with Cancer.
It was unbelievable. I mean, this is the fastest ever, and it's just the word getting out over 10 years. So next year we'll try and have 20,000 pounds here.
In Victoria, fishers were out Friday morning catching herring. Bags were sold for $20 for 20 pounds. Those not interested in the fresh fish, smoked kipper sandwiches were also available. Since 2011, the fundraiser has raised over $1 million for cancer patients at BC Children's Hospital. Well, they were denied a grant from the city for their Downtown Eastside art program, but just days later, the community has rallied around the Vancouver area network of drug users, giving them nearly double the amount they had applied for.
So it's a little bit upsetting that a municipal level government would actually cut something that's so vital to the community. That being said, I was pretty overwhelmed by the response from the community and how people really did care about the Downtown East Side.
VANDU was looking for $7,500 for its art program. They've now raised more than $12,000 in an online fundraiser. Active drug users who use the program say expressing themselves creatively is even more important during the toxic drug crisis. Some participants credit the program for saving their lives.
It takes people away from if their addiction or the troubles on the street. It just gets them out of that space for a minute.
ABC councillor Sarah Kirby-Young says she voted to cut VANDU's funding because it failed to fulfill a street stewardship contract last summer. The organization denies those claims and says one has nothing to do with the other. VANDU's was the only grant out of 84 recommended by city staff. The ABC council majority did not approve. Families are thrilled as the federal court orders the government to bring back 4 Canadian men being held in Syria. But convincing Kurdish forces to release the suspected ISIS members may not be that easy. Stay with us. A memorial was held in Ukraine today for the government officials killed in Wednesday's helicopter crash. The accident happened just outside the capital in heavy fog. Ukraine's interior minister was killed, along with his deputy minister and 5 other department members. President Volodymyr Zelensky was among the mourners today. It comes with the war almost 11 months old. The victims of the crash were reportedly on their way to the front lines. The United States is taking action against an organization widely believed to have thousands of mercenaries fighting for Russia in Ukraine. Washington plans to unveil sanctions against the Wagner Group and its members next week. CBC's Chris Reyes reports.
In a message on the app Telegram, the head of the private Russian military contractor Wagner Group asked what crime his company committed, addressing it to the White House and National Security spokesperson John Kirby. On Friday, Kirby singled out the company directly, announcing that new sanctions against the company will be coming next week.
The Department of Treasury will be designating Wagner as a significant transnational criminal organization.
Along with the announcement, the U.S. also released newly declassified photos of Russian rail cars heading into North Korea and sent back. The U.S. believes this was the initial delivery of infantry rockets and missiles for use by the mercenary organization in Ukraine. Earlier this month, the group's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was shaking hands with Russian volunteer fighters coming back from Ukraine. He said, "You fulfilled your contracts, and you fulfilled them with honor and dignity." According to the U.S., some 50,000 Wagner Group fighters are currently in Ukraine, many of them convicts.
It's become clear that in order to defeat Russia on the battlefield, there has to be something done against the Wagner Group, which is, again, an entity that the Kremlin has become increasingly reliant on for battlefield maneuvers.
Canada has also condemned the Wagner Group in recent months. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly said the transaction of weapons from North Korea by Wagner clearly violates international law and United Nations Security Council resolutions. Prigozhin has been called Putin's chef because of his influential role in the Kremlin. However, the Wagner Group is not formally connected to the Russian government.
There had to be a separate set of sanctions imposed on the Wagner Group. And again, the purpose is to cut the Wagner Group from any financial resources.
Last December, the European Union also imposed sanctions on the Wagner Group. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
A federal court ruled yesterday the government must bring back 4 Canadian men being held in Syria, all of them suspected of being ISIS members. It follows news that 19 women and children will be brought back to Canada. As the CBC's Ithil Musa reports, relatives are thrilled, but convincing Kurdish forces to release the men may not be easy.
We're overjoyed at the news.
Sally Lane and her family have been fighting for years to get her son Jack Letts out of Syria. She says he traveled there in 2014 after converting to Islam as a teen, inspired by the Arab Spring and the uprisings against Bashar al-Assad's regime.
He wanted to help the victims of what was going on at that time with what Assad was doing to his citizens.
But Letts has been in prison in northeastern Syria for more than 5 years. He's accused of being a member of ISIS. It's something he's admitted to in British media, but his family says the admission was made in prison and under duress.
That interview was actually the fruit of torture.
His lawyer also says there is no evidence that Letts or any other Canadians detained ever fought for the terrorist group.
They've been sitting in arbitrary detention for 5 years with no legal steps being taken at all. If Canada has charges against them, they can charge them when they get home.
But a former U.S. diplomat says Kurdish forces may not let that happen.
These men are accused of participating in an organization that engaged in mass killings, enslaved Yazidi girls, thousands of them, engaged in horrific torture and rape. And so the Syrian Kurds want to be sure that they face the same kind of justice in Canada that they would have faced in Syria. And that's far from clear.
Letz's lawyer isn't worried the 4 men won't be repatriated.
The Kurds follow what's going on in other countries. They have been advocating for the repatriation of these prisoners, not just to Canada, but to other countries of nationality, because they shouldn't be responsible.
Global Affairs Canada says it is reviewing the federal court's decision and will have more to say in due time. It also says the safety and security of Canadians is a top priority. Idil Musa, CBC News, Toronto.
Tens of thousands have joined a day of protests in Israel against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan for judicial reform. The event in Tel Aviv was expected to draw 100,000. The reforms would tighten political control of judicial appointments and limit the Supreme Court's ability to overturn legislation. The protesters say that threatens the judiciary's independence and Israeli democracy. Netanyahu says the measures are to curb activist judges, and he calls the protests a refusal to accept his election victory. The U.S.'s first Indigenous woman in space ventured out today on a spacewalk. NASA astronaut Nicole Mann was joined by a Japanese astronaut. Their job was to prepare the International Space Station for more solar panels. Mann is a member of the Wailaki tribe in Northern California. The 45-year-old veteran combat pilot took off for the space station back in October. And you're looking at a live shot, not space, but from the top of the CBC towers here at Cambie Street. There's City Hall in the background on a pretty nice night. We're looking at some sunshine tomorrow. I'll have your forecast coming up after the break. Time now to take a look at the forecast. It has been a very wet one today and actually cooler quite a bit than it has been the last couple of weeks. You can see it's 5 degrees at Vancouver Airport. That's not so bad, but if you take a look out in West Van, just sitting at 1 degree. I believe last weekend we were about 5-6 degrees over even in West Van, 2 degrees in Abbotsford, 3 degrees in Pitt Meadows, and in Nanaimo looking at a 3, and even across the border. It's cool, sitting at 3 in Bellingham. There's your forecast across the province there, a little bit of a mixed bag. If you're in Dease Lake, looking at some flurries, a -2. Prince Rupert, it will be a wet one. 4 degrees will be your high. Sunny, though, for most other spots, as you can see. -1 in Prince George, at the freezing mark in Williams Lake. Also goes for Kelowna, looking at a 0. Cranbrook, you are going to see some flurries tomorrow. Hopefully you'll see a break of sun. -2 will be your high. Victoria, looking at 7 degrees, not too shabby. And Port Hardy, 5 degrees, mostly cloudy. There's your 5-day forecast there. Tomorrow, 6 degrees will be our high, mostly cloudy through the day. By the time you get to the late afternoon, you might start seeing those showers creep in. And then Monday, starting the work week with a bit of rain. What do we expect? It's Vancouver, right? 3 degrees will be our high. And then Tuesday, temperatures pick up again, looking at 5. Wednesday, another break of sun. That'll be pretty nice. Thursday, though, back to the rainfall. So a bit of a mixed bag of a week to come. But I am very grateful that it's going to be sunny tomorrow, 5 degrees. It's the Lunar New Year parade in Chinatown. I'll be there along with a number of, my CBC colleagues. I hope to see you all down there. It should be a nice one. That is your late news for this Saturday. Thank you so much for watching. For news at any hour, you can always go to our website, cbc.ca/BC. I'll see you back here tomorrow and hopefully in Chinatown. Have a good night.